Welcome to the Crime Redefined podcast, produced by Zero Cliff Media. Coming to you from the US Bank Tower, high above downtown Los Angeles. In our podcast, we drill deep into forensics and criminal investigation from the viewpoint of the defense, as well as explore the intersection of the media and the justice system.
I'm Dion Mitchell here with Mehul Anjaria, and today's episode is an introduction to us and our podcast, Crime Redefined.
Hi, I'm Mehul Anjaria. I am a forensic DNA expert. I'm an independent expert. I have a firm in Los Angeles, MBA DNA Consulting, and I work with criminal defense attorneys, civil attorneys, and inmates who are representing themselves. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about what exactly that is later in the episode, but my job is to help my attorney and inmate clients understand complicated DNA evidence, review the work of other labs, and just point out what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses, and what can you do with this in court. So to that end, I will testify myself as an expert witness, but I'll also help the attorneys out in their cross-examination. So that may involve me writing out questions for them. That may involve me actually sitting in court and helping them out on the fly. So when I say DNA expert, and I'll talk about my career trajectory, but I'm not sitting in a laboratory with test tubes anymore. I'm a consultant. I'm working in the courts. I'm going to jail. If there is testing involved in a case, I'll go collect evidence at a police station, but then I'll send it off to a private lab and let them do that type of work.
You know, how am I supposed to follow that? You know, I work in entertainment for a number of years now, and I'm going to be upstaged by a DNA expert. My background, I'm a former actor and stunt performer, and I've worked on every major continent. I'm now the co-founder and executive producer for Zero Cliff Media.
So I guess everybody's wondering, well, what the heck, what does one have to do with the other? And obviously we have this production company, Zero Cliff Media, but, you know, we've known each other now, I'm going to say about 13 years.
Yeah, at least.
Right. So this started with a project that you were involved in that crossed entertainment into DNA. So if you want to start the story, and then I can just kind of chime in as necessary.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I was developing a DNA crime show and was introduced to Mehul by a mutual friend. The show wasn't picked up, famous last words in Hollywood, but we stayed in contact. And from there, it's kind of a typical story. I was stuck in traffic on the 405 and checking in with friends. And it was in one of those calls where Mehul was describing a recent stop to see one of his clients in Men's Central Jail, which is just not an everyday conversation in itself, that I realized that Mehul and his world were the story.
Okay, so hopefully we've got, hopefully we have any listeners, but hopefully we have listeners from around the world. So just to frame, the universe we're talking about is primarily Los Angeles. So in Los Angeles, the primary county jail is Men's Central Jail. And I'm pretty sure that we're going to say Men's Central Jail, MCJ, that's the main county jail. We'll probably be talking about that quite a bit. So
just think TMZ, and every time you see someone going to jail on TMZ, this is where they're being taken to.
This is true. This is 100% true. And so you bring up TMZ, and part of this podcast is it's going to be scientific because it is about forensic evidence, but hopefully it's more the role of forensic evidence in the criminal justice system. So it's not all geeking out, but we're also going to touch on entertainment. And you almost have to when you're doing this in Los Angeles. Obviously, there's big trials all the time that get a lot of headlines. And so we're going to weigh in on that as well.
Well, let's dive in then. This is the land of all things O.J. Simpson, and it's been obviously back in the public eye for the last year or so. Give us your take.
Well, there's a lot of take-homes from here, and let me just kind of give you where I was in 1995 when this trial was going on. I had actually just graduated from the University of Illinois in Chicago. That's the area that I grew up in. And during the trial that summer, I actually came out to Los Angeles to interview for the Los Angeles Police Department as a criminalist. And which is kind of ironic because at the time that lab was being given quite a bum rap. You know, it was sort of called the cesspool of contamination. And I was trying to get in there for a job. So literally, I remember when I was taking the test or whatever for the position on a lunch break, I walked over to the courthouse because I wanted to see the spectacle. And yeah, that was, you know, here I'm a guy from the Midwest coming out to Los Angeles for one of the first times, and I saw the media circus firsthand. And so when I talk about OJ, I like to kind of look at it more clinically. There's a lot you can talk about: celebrity, race, money, all that kind of stuff. We've heard a million times, but I look at it through the lens of forensic science. And this was actually the best thing to ever happen to forensic science and DNA. And that's because all of a sudden, all of the techniques, all of the procedures were under a microscope like we've never seen before. And sure enough, there were some holes that were exposed and became embarrassing. So after this trial, I know for a fact that a lot of labs tightened up their procedures, their protocols, and laboratories becoming accredited was all of a sudden more important. Also, you know, you look at what can you unpack from this, and I just look at all of my cases, and I just think, you know, if the lead detective in any major case is asked point blank, did you plant any evidence? And the response is, I plead the fifth. I mean, the game is over, right?
That cannot be good.
Take away everything else. Take away the reason for, you know, how F. Lee Bailey got the information to impeach Mark Fuhrman, all of that. But at the end of the day, if the lead detective cannot answer that question, you've just got serious problems.
Wow. I just can't imagine coming from Chicago and then your first week in the town is this front row seat for just this pure, like you said, a circus.
Right. And, you know, as I watched this trial on TV, you know, back in Illinois, one thing I was really fascinated with is, you know, here's these attorneys who are presumably at the top of their game, right? Because they're on the biggest case in the world at the time. But many of the attorneys really on both sides also, it seemed, had a command of this DNA evidence and the science behind it. And that has really left an impression on me to this day. The fact of, you know, having to know not only the attorney stuff and the courtroom stuff, but the science of DNA. And along with that, and, you know, I mean, I guess, well, Dion, we're getting kind of old, and, you know, this trial was quite a while ago. There's probably people listening to us who don't even know much about it, but sort of the famous cross-examination of attorney Barry Scheck, their DNA expert attorney, cross-examining Dennis Fung and just really beating him up. I looked at that and I said, wow, look at the abuse that a criminalist has to take on. I'm like, I wanted that challenge. So all of those things actually motivated me to become a criminalist, because remember, I just graduated college. I wasn't in the field yet. So all of that had a really profound effect on me.
Would you call that a turning point then in your career?
I think so. I had known a little bit about the field of forensic science, but when I saw some of the dynamics, I thought, yeah, I want to do this.
I want to go back for a second. You mentioned something the command of the defense attorneys had for DNA. Were you impressed by that command at that particular time? Because right. DNA obviously was 3 letters that most people had never heard put together.
Well, that might be a little bit of a loaded question, because it could be that because I wasn't in the business, I thought, wow, these guys know a lot. Because later I come to find out that defense attorneys don't know a whole lot about DNA, and that's why I'm doing what I do. But again, on the OJ case, we were looking at people who were absolute experts in this. And, you know, you're right. To your point, in 1995, this was relatively new science. And in a way, it was the unveiling of DNA evidence to the masses or to pop culture. So there weren't that many experts, period.
Well, what an advantage, because they could take advantage of that lack of knowledge in the public and within the court system, because they could have said the sky is brown, you know, talking about DNA, and everybody would not know the difference. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, that's very true. And, you know, on top of that, I think we've learned a lot of how to talk about DNA or present DNA in a trial, because obviously a lot of it was a big snooze fest because they were going on for days and days and days. Now, I think in court, juries know a little bit about this, and it's interesting to them, if for no other reason that they've seen it on TV. But back then, you're trying to teach science class, and you're going on ad nauseum, it's putting people to sleep.
When you explain it and lay it out this way, you really see the need for people like you, is that there is that lack of knowledge, and that if you don't have, the big bank account, you need someone to come in there and help you. Otherwise, you can just get, railroaded out of town on this DNA evidence if you don't understand it.
Absolutely true. DNA is a huge hammer. It's a powerful tool that has a big reputation behind it. So, but the jury needs to know the whole story. And the DNA of 1995 or 1984 is not the same as the DNA as far as technology of 2018.
I can imagine. So now, since we've talked about the case, let's name drop. We're in LA. It's a Hollywood town. If you've ever run across any of the O.J. Simpson team.
I have actually gotten to work with quite a few people, so that's been kind of interesting. In fact, about 3 or 4 years ago, I had the honor of working with Robert Shapiro on what I think was actually his last criminal case. So I was a defense DNA expert, and as it turned out, the trial where I testified in was actually the O.J. Simpson courtroom.
Oh,
so that was kind of weird being there,
wow,
almost 20 years later, but really the same kind of issues.
Were you saying that Robert Shapiro is retiring or has retired?
Well, I don't think that he does criminal cases anymore.
Oh,
I think he was
all just civil. Yeah,
exactly. Just finishing up what he started. Obviously, he's doing LegalZoom and all this kind of stuff as well.
How was that working with him?
Well, it was fun. I mean, one of the best parts was, at lunch, just kind of talking DNA with him, and that was really, really a kick for a DNA geek like me.
Any inside stories or anything he wanted to share with you on the OJ case?
Well, I kind of knew, I knew my OJ trivia pretty well, so a lot of the stuff we discussed, I had already heard about, and so it was cool. It was a cool exchange.
I was hoping he was going to tell you where the knife was at.
Aha. Yeah, none of that.
All right, so let's move on, and why don't you tell me how do you get here from Chicago to Los Angeles?
Okay,
what does that look like?
Well, I'd already mentioned I went to undergrad, University of Illinois at Chicago, and I was studying biochemistry, and I wasn't 100% sure what I wanted to do with that. And one day at a career fair, the Illinois State Police was there giving a presentation, and they were talking about forensic DNA analysis. Now, I knew from my studies that I most enjoyed DNA, molecular biology, all that kind of stuff, but I don't know that I wanted to be a lab rat per se and just do experiments. I assumed that if you were a law enforcement criminalist that you had to be a cop, and that was the case many years ago. So when I talked to the Illinois State Police, I realized you don't have to be a cop. And what I liked about the career at the time was you could work with DNA, but you weren't stuck in a lab. You got to go to court. You got to go to crime scenes. Here was a practical application of DNA study. And that's really what lit the initial fire in me. And then it just so happened that, a year or so after that, we had the O.J. Simpson case. And I was like, yeah, this is what I want to do.
And this is where I want to be?
Well, as it happened, and when I was looking for jobs, I wasn't just looking in Los Angeles. Like any kid right out of college, you'll go wherever fate will take you to get a gig. So I used to say, listen, if I got to go to Boise, Idaho, I'm going to do it. But actually, my first job as a law enforcement criminalist was in San Bernardino County. So not quite Los Angeles, but just an hour outside.
It's probably kind of a good, not jumping right into the deep end of the pool, though, right? Beginning in Riverside?
Well, not even so much. Well, yeah, it was a smaller laboratory, which was good. But also, I didn't start out as a DNA criminalist right off the bat, because at the time, you didn't start out the newbies there because the DNA was a complicated lab process. There were obviously more serious cases, and the court testimony was more involved. So my first gig was actually in doing controlled substances, analysis. So analysis of drugs, meth, cocaine, heroin, PCP. But what was unique about where I was working in San Bernardino County is there was a humongous meth lab problem. And in fact, San Bernardino County was the meth lab capital of the world.
Oh, man.
So I was on the on-call team, and I would go out to these meth lab crime scenes, and you would get a ton of experience in a very short time because it was so prevalent. If you were on call for a week, you would go out to 4, 5, 6 meth labs. And some of these were, I'm not talking just a small garage, I'm talking Mexican national, organized crime type laboratories. So that's actually my entree into forensic science for about the first 3 years of my career.
Okay, so for those of us, me included, that's never been to a meth lab, give us kind of a 30-second look at what that physically looks like.
Well, it's a little bit different. I guess I'm somewhat of a OG in meth labs in that it was done way differently back then than it is now. But you're looking at, I don't want to say sophisticated chemistry going on, because obviously any idiot could do it, but you're looking at very dangerous chemistry. You've got fumes that could kill you. You've got chemical reactions that could blow up. So some of the labs look crude. In other words, instead of beakers and flasks, you had 2-liter bottles and you had 5-gallon buckets, but you had all of these dangerous chemicals going on. And, some were more safety conscious than others. You looked at obviously there's a lot of issues with ventilation and dangerous fumes. So some people didn't ventilate. Some people had a homemade ventilation system where they had tubing going into cat litter. So there's all sorts of ingenuity. But we used to joke that 2 things you would always see at a meth lab in San Bernardino County, particularly in the 90s. You would also always see a dartboard, presumably because if you're on meth staying up all night, you got to have something to do. And much to the delight of the narcotics detectives, the males, I should say, there was always pornography. So I guess, again, you had to have something to do.
Oh, man, I can't even imagine. All right, so you're doing the crime lab. How do you make the transition from working for Riverside to the defense?
Well, before we even get there, let's get me to DNA. Okay, so my goal in getting into forensic science was to get into DNA. Now, I actually had to take an additional class. So while I was working in the meth labs and the drugs, I took a molecular biology class, and then that allowed me to have all of the credentials I needed to become a DNA analyst. So about 3 years into my career, I then became a DNA criminalist. This would be about December of 1998. And so I did that for about 6 years until 2005. So I was a law enforcement criminalist, working cases, testifying in court, writing reports, training other analysts, all that kind of good stuff. And I was lucky enough to work in a lab where, as a criminalist, I handled all aspects of the case. Nowadays, in DNA analysis, it's very assembly line because a lot more samples are running through a laboratory. So I had the benefit, I guess, of being able to work a case from beginning to end and really got a lot of great experience. So then in 2005, a coworker of mine had this crazy idea that we should actually branch out and start up our own private DNA laboratory. And the idea was that, hey, DNA is becoming very popular. It's used in a lot of cases. And we knew that all the laboratories were backlogged. And, in our casework, we couldn't do all the samples. We knew that there had to be additional resources. So in 2005, I actually left my county job in San Bernardino to do this essentially startup laboratory. And ultimately, we became the first what's known as ASCLD Lab International Accredited DNA Laboratory in California. We did casework for the prosecution, but we also started doing casework for the defense, and that was my first taste of that. So I began to be a little bit more well-rounded and understood both sides of the coin. Now, what was really interesting is that in addition to doing defense work, I started working with these inmates who represent themselves as their own attorney. They're known as pro pers. So that was kind of my nexus from, the defense is called the dark side, classically. If you work in a crime lab, or at least when I did, we would joke around that the defense is the dark side. So when I went into the private sector, I slowly started morphing into that dark side.
How are you received with your former colleagues once you made that transition?
I think that there were some issues. I thought, wow, there's a lot of blowback now to being a defense laboratory. And I think that it hurt our ability to get prosecution work because for some reason we started to be known as a defense lab, even though we weren't. It's just that we were branching out and working with everybody. So you see the biases on both sides. On one hand, when I worked in crime labs, we would joke, haha, the defense is the dark side. But then I would start going to defense attorney conferences and they would start ripping on the crime lab people. And I would take that somewhat personally, thinking, wait a minute, those are my colleagues. So there was this adjustment period for me. And ultimately in 2009, I went off on my own to be an independent consultant. And at that point, I think I was very seasoned in both sides of the game, as well as the legal aspect, because now I had been working more with attorneys, with inmates themselves, and I just had a broader picture. And ultimately, my feeling was that the defense needed more help than the prosecution. Prosecution has a lot of infrastructure. They have the crime labs, they have their own criminalists, and the defense had nothing. They relied on independent experts. Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, so it sounds like you were at least trying to level the playing field a little bit against the resources of the state.
That's exactly it. And so at first, like I say, that wasn't that fun to be the underdog, but I think I started enjoying that role. But from a practical sense, you're exactly right. I felt like the playing field was not level. When I testified as a law enforcement criminalist, I'd have these defense attorneys cross-examine me, and quite frankly, it sucked. They were not asking the right questions. There's always some weakness to evidence, even if it's DNA. And I found out that, I felt that the cross-exams were uninformed. They were boilerplate. They were just snarky, more personal attacks. I thought, this is not doing anybody any justice whatsoever. So I guess that would be my descent into the dark side, so to speak, working for the defense. And, we kid about that, but now look at all of the exonerations we have with DNA.
Yeah, that's right.
We know intellectually that the government cannot always get it right. And a lot of times there's not a cross-check on that. But with DNA, there is a cross-check. So we're finding out that, wow, a lot of people are wrongly convicted. So most of my work is pre-conviction state. In other words, to make sure that, that the defense has a fair shake and that they understand the DNA evidence that their client is up against. I will work on post-conviction cases as well.
Wow. I always put myself in your shoes, and you're sitting down with rapists and serial killers, and you're, like you said, you're trying to just level the playing field. But how do you answer that question? How do you handle working for the dark side and representing and working with some of these guys?
Well, first of all, this is not for everybody. Most people who are scientists, the last thing they want to be doing is going to the jail or talking. Well, first of all, honestly, when you work in a crime lab, you don't even want to talk to the attorneys because that's a whole different world, even if they're on your side. So much less you want to deal with defense attorneys or inmates. So I felt like not many people want to do it. So maybe in a way, this is my calling. I have the stomach for it. I think I need to do this. So, okay, working with the defense. Well, number one, everybody is entitled to a fair trial. And I think that due diligence is owed. I mean, if you're going to put someone away for life or execute them, I think there should be some due diligence. And I think that all parties should understand what the actual evidence is and what we're dealing with.
Well, let me jump in there. That's, I think, what gets lost for the average person, and let me play the role of that average person, is that regardless of the crime, regardless of the person, the background, is that either we have a court system or we don't. And everybody deserves the right to a fair trial. And if one side is so heavily stacked for the prosecution, then people are just going to be, you see why we have a lot of overcrowding. I'm not saying that's the main reason, but a lot of people are just pleading out. Am I right?
You are. It becomes a very dangerous situation, if one side has all the power. There has to be some kind of cross-check. And, along those lines, if you think about, it's all one justice system. Okay, there's a prosecution, there's a defense, but there's essentially one goal here to sort of get at the truth. And if you think about a criminal defense case, if that defendant is not represented properly and was not given a fair shake and they get convicted, there's all sorts of grounds for appeal, right?
Right.
That's going to come out. Even if the guy or woman is convicted, it's going to come out eventually in the appeal, all the shortcomings. It could be ineffective counsel, the attorney. It could be that evidence wasn't looked at. Could be that experts weren't hired. So why not do it right in the first place? Because that benefits everybody. So let's say there is just a awful crime, and maybe there's a ton of evidence. Well, wouldn't you want that person? Wouldn't you want proper due diligence and a strong defense to occur in the first place so that if that person is convicted, that conviction will stand?
No, I agree. And at the end of the day, the science doesn't lie. I mean, if the evidence is there, the DNA and the science is there, and it's presented right, and there's no corruption, it's gonna play itself out, and that person is going to go to jail for that crime.
The science is the same for either side. But what we're going to learn in this podcast is that DNA is just not so cut and dried. It depends on context, depends on what type of DNA, where it was found. Contrast that with, say, like a blood alcohol case. You analyze the blood, you get a number. Okay, if you want to challenge that, the other side tests it, they get a number. It is what it is. And I think the public tends to think that's the case with DNA. Either you have it or you don't, and it's not. So it is on how it's presented and how it's challenged that will differ between the two different sides, the prosecution and the defense. That's been
probably my biggest takeaway in working with you, is that there's so much gray area. And like everybody else, before we started working together, you hear DNA and you think, okay, they've got DNA evidence. He or she must be guilty. And that is absolutely just not the case.
Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. And I think a lot of times we think that all forensic evidence is DNA. I hear the two terms interchanged quite a bit. So DNA is just one type of physical evidence. There are other factors in a case as well.
Yeah, I think that the problem now is DNA and forensics has been so injected into our TV shows and media that they're putting words together that should not be together, and you're getting a real, the wrong look and understanding of how it actually works in science and in the courtroom.
Well, and that's one of the things that you and I are going to tackle in episodes coming up in this podcast. We're going to kind of call out some of the media portrayal of forensics and just kind of compare that to what's real and how it really goes down.
Yeah, I think we're not going to point fingers. We're just going to say, hey, look, this is how they're using it, but this is how it really works. Just so hopefully through our podcast, people can understand the difference.
Absolutely. It's just for interest. I mean, obviously Hollywood has to take shortcuts and stuff like that. We all know that. But I do think that the public, would like to know what it really means or how this stuff really goes down.
Well, I'm excited. I'm looking forward to episode number 2, and we'll tackle a lot more subjects like this and have some fun with it.
All right. I look forward to it.
All right. Thanks, Mehul.
Thank you for listening to the Crime Redefined podcast. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter @Crime Redefined. Please send us your comments and questions and join us for the next episode.